So at this time, I think we want to move on to our second panel, and I'd like to invite them to the stage and introduce our next moderator, Dr. Jeff Lerner. Jeff is president and CEO of the ECRI Institute, which is an independent nonprofit organization that researches approaches to improving patient care. He and ECRI have been a terrific collaborator with BPC on a range of topics over the last many years, and I'll now hand it over to him to briefly introduce our second panel. Jeff?
Thanks very much. Appreciate being here, and I really appreciate this discussion. I think it's actually essential. And I'd like to do the introduction for the panel in a very efficient way. Not by my telling you who they are, but having them tell you who they are and why it matters for comparative effectiveness research. So I'm going to start with Sarah, even though she's sitting in the middle. But remember, we're calling this patient-centered, so let's start here.
Well, thank you. So my name is Sarah Van Gertruden. I am the executive director of a coalition called the Partnership to Improve Patient Care, which is also known as PIPC. PIPC actually came together when Senator Conrad and Senator Baucus and others were working on the legislation in Congress to create a Comparative Effectiveness Institute. And my organization and the groups that are part of it strongly supported the version that was being bantered about in the Senate. It was, as the congressman said on the last panel, very different from what the House was pushing and considering. That would have potentially had more of an impact on driving what we would call a one-size-fits-all healthcare system, or driving more standardized treatments based on the outcomes of a comparative effectiveness research plan. So, one of the things I think, we're most excited about with PCORI and the way that it was created is, its independence is obviously very important. But I think the fact that they are looking at the impact of different treatments based on the outcomes that matter to patients. And so when you think about what's truly valuable to a patient, that's really the key component, is are you achieving the outcomes that matter to patients? And the only way that you're going to get there is by looking at the implications of these different treatments on those individual outcomes so that patients can say, this is what I want to achieve with my care. And I applaud you for doing this panel. We did an event last Friday on quality-adjusted life years, which Bill brought up on the last panel. Try making quality-adjusted life years interesting, right? It's not easy, but it's a really key thing for people and policymakers to understand, because it's the distinction between doing clinical effectiveness research, which is what PCORI does, and doing cost-effectiveness research, which is what other organizations are doing, like ICER, and that may come up later. But so I think we really want to focus on how this impacts the patient and how patients can use this information to improve their decision-making at the point of care.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll go in order. I know the folks here, but now you'll know them better. So why don't we start on that end? That's Don Liss. He'll tell you why he's here.
Good morning. So I'm a recovering health plan medical director. But for purposes of this morning, I'll try and stay in role as the guy who's ultimately responsible, at least in the context of health plan operations, of making both coverage policy, establishing what services are covered and aren't covered under the terms and conditions of a health plan, and typically supervising, but ultimately responsible for those individual coverage decisions in any individual case. And to the extent comparative effectiveness research is a critical element in informing both the development of policy and the application of that policy, of that coverage determination in an individual case. So, and we could go a long conversation about the mechanisms that get you there, but ultimately it's the definition of, quote, medical necessity in an insurance contract that determines whether a given service is covered. And several of the provisions of that definition, that construct, point to the outcome, the yield, if you will, of comparative effectiveness research to inform that decision. Now that creates an incredible ambivalence around whether CER is being used to make coverage decisions or not, but it certainly informs the basis for them. And I look forward to more conversation on that point later.
You'll have it. Noel, tell us why you're here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm Noel McAwee. I'm a clinical pharmacist and epidemiologist. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry now for a little over 25 years. I won't go over everything that's in the bio that all of you have, but will tell you that the reason that I'm a real advocate of comparative effectiveness research is that it's apparent to me that most of what we do in medicine, we just don't have good evidence to support the decisions. And the estimates are that as much as 80% of what we do in medicine doesn't have good evidence behind it. So from my perspective, this is really not just about comparing drug A versus drug B, but this is about looking at our entire system and generating evidence to support those decisions. So I look forward to getting into the weeds of that later on. So thank you.
We shall. And Joel?
Well, I'm a cardiologist, and I guess you could say I'm a recovering medical school dean, which takes longer to recover than many other things. But after I was a dean of a medical school, I came to Washington. For a few years, I was the scholar in residence at the then called Institute of Medicine. And my first experience with what we then called effectiveness research was to convene several meetings of different stakeholders and interests in effectiveness research and in various sides of it, and wrote a paper with the Clinical Research Roundtable, as it was then called, on developing a public-private corporation, a public-private entity to do comparative effectiveness research, which was going to be a balance of stakeholders who are involved in it. That ultimately became the structure of PCORI, actually. We had, I think, some very interesting meetings at that time, and much of the discussion that was in this last panel and will be in this panel, we had about 13 or 14 years ago about effectiveness research. After that, I became the Chief Research and Development Officer at the VA, and the VA has a long history of comparative effectiveness research dating back to the mid-1970s. It is really a pioneer in this area. And while most people don't think of it when they think of overall federal budget funding and all that, it is a very crucial part of comparative effectiveness research. The initial studies on coronary bypass surgery, for example, were done in the VA, and their results still hold after 40 years. Many others, the prostate cancer, prostate hypertrophy, many other studies on health systems. And during the 8 years I was there, we increased it, we funded more of it, and we also developed some ways that we think improved it and made it more relevant and usable. And then after that, one other thing I did after that was I was a member of the Federal Coordinating Council on Comparative Effectiveness Research, which was one out of the earlier ARA Act, and that's pretty much what I've done. Now I am the Director of Veterans Initiatives at Georgetown University and a Professor of Medicine.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll tell you something very quickly not about myself, but about my organization and why I'm the moderator. So VA was doing things in the 1970s. Fortunately, we were doing things before then. My organization is a nonprofit. It's like Consumer Reports. It was compared to, and it was in fact modeled on that. So objectively looking at how well drugs, devices, procedures work if you strip away the marketing. So just the data. And this goes back to the late 1960s with very important findings. Even our very first study, which was done in our laboratories, which was of manual resuscitation bags. So those are used in emergency situations. It's life-threatening. There were 18 on the market, 9 couldn't work. Okay? Not that they would be flawed, they couldn't work. As a result of our study, those 9 were removed by a series of actions, not by the FDA, because they didn't have medical device authority until 1976. So there's a role for the private sector as well as the public sector. And that's a theme that we'll come into later. Now, of course, there are many other incidents I could cite, some quite famous over the course of the decades. But I'll hold off on that so that we can get to a paired set of questions for our panelists. But we'll ask the questions separately. The first question I'm going to ask them to comment on are the challenges to CER. The paired question and the rest of the panel will be on the opportunities and the forward future of comparative effectiveness research. But past is present, so we need to look at the challenges. So why don't we start?
Sure. So the biggest challenge, and I think Dr. Gingrey referenced this in his comments, is the nuance of medical care. As precision medicine comes to the fore, not only are patients identifiable by different characteristics, they're identifiable by essentially their genetic fingerprint, such that the ability to generalize the findings of any given study to a larger population is potentially harder. The flip side of that is that there's opportunity. The breakthroughs in medical science are phenomenal, and the specificity by which a physician or others can identify the patient for whom a given service or treatment is most effective are potentially much better. But there's a push and pull that's a challenge, and I think that's the biggest challenge for comparative effectiveness research. In other words, if it works for a population, does it work for my patient?
Okay, so that's one type of challenge. Noel?
So, and I would agree with the clinical nuance, very difficult. The other challenge that I see is just as as we get into the political realm of making decisions about funding agencies and so forth. So I lived through the era of evidence-based medicine in the 1990s. This was primarily a physician-driven movement where people were recognizing that we didn't have evidence to make decisions. And I think as we moved into the 2000s and following Gail Walensky's seminal paper in 2006, then you started to see a lot of discussions about use of this for coverage decisions and not use of it for an individual treatment decision where you have one physician and one patient in an exam room with the door shut making a decision about treatment. And so I think as we get back to that focus, I think we'll be in much better shape.
Okay. And Sarah?
And that's a great segue to my point here. I think that the biggest challenge for CER going forward is to decide who is your intended audience. I mean, are we doing CER to help patients improve their clinical decision making? Are we trying to help them understand the outcomes, what's going to happen to me on this treatment? Going back to your point about what happens, if that patient wants to play golf, or that patient has goals or things they want to achieve with their treatment that don't necessarily line up with sort of the A versus B, which one works better. So yeah, I mean, I think the first challenge is to identify what is it are you doing this to help payers make a standardized treatment decision for doctors, or are you doing this research to help patients and providers make better decisions based on what the patient wants and needs out of their treatment? Our hope is that we're going for the more patient-centered version of that, and that's what comparative effectiveness is intended to do. But to me, that is the key challenge: is what are we trying to accomplish with this information? And if that's the case, then we need to be focusing on organizations like Picori.
Okay, give us a big challenge, Joe.
Well, I would agree, first of all, with the individualization, which I might call it, of comparative effectiveness research. That's a huge issue. And it's not only precision medicine and genetics, it's site differences, local culture, patient preferences, all kinds of things that one used to call clinical judgment, or could even call, in some cases, common sense, to use this. I think another major challenge is the utilization of this, getting the word out to the people who are going to use the information, which in my view should be doctors and patients and health systems for certain kinds of information. And I think that's very important. We haven't figured out yet how to do that. Certainly doing it in relation to just journal publications and CME courses and that sort of thing does not work to get the information out to individuals. I would say the third challenge is funding. And I would say funding in the private sector. And it's not only, I would go beyond funding, but in-kind support. There's a lot of data out there that you could look at in a comparative way from databases that are generated by the pharmaceutical industry as well as by health plans. And if we could figure out some way that that data might be usable, I think that would be very significant progress in this area. And we wouldn't, I don't think we should be, I think the federal government is important. Obviously important, and what we did at the VA would not have been funded by the private sector. And we thought about that. I mean, when we decided how to do, what to pick as a topic for our studies in this area, we thought, well, nobody else is going to fund this. This is an important notion. We have to fund it. This is an important thing to study. So, but I do think that there's a lot of data out there that we could use, and we need to improve the science a bit on how to look at it comparatively, but I think that's on the way.
Okay. I want to read you a definition, and I'll tell you what it's about in a moment. Here's the quote. This type of research we're discussing is socio-technical research that discloses the benefits and risks to society emanating from alternative courses in the development of scientific and technological opportunities. That's a very interesting and current quote said by Representative Daddario in the 1960s when he was describing what was then called technology assessment. So one of our issues is it's actually a pretty well-crafted language. And I think what we have to also consider is, are we, in fact, having an effect that society can feel, can see, whether it's physicians or patients? And so that's part of this challenge of looking at the future of comparative effectiveness research. So now let's start to turn our discussion to what are our opportunities? And again, you don't have to necessarily go in order, but don't get too far out of order or I'll look like a terrible moderator. Okay? So would somebody like to start on that key opportunities?
So I'll keep us in order and not have anyone criticize the moderator. I'll step up. To perhaps pile on a bit to Dr. Coopersmith's comments, one tremendous opportunity in an era where electronic health records are essential, all but universal, and relational databases are available for all sorts of biomedical information. One could envision a circumstance where just about every patient interaction is part of a pragmatic trial. In other words, the information is captured, it's available. Now there's a lot of reasons, there's all kinds of, HIPAA perhaps being the most significant privacy protection issues, that's hard and really difficult to do. But there's an opportunity to leverage medical care being delivered in the ordinary course to inform improvements. And I would advocate as on sort of the opportunity scale that's perhaps the best hope for making robust information available. Lots of other opportunities, but that's one I'll put on the table.
All right. Comments?
So that's exactly where I was going.
I went first.
Yes, there you go. So, I think Google probably experiments on us every day and we don't even know it. When I think about the framework for doing this kind of stuff in healthcare, you've got pragmatic randomized trials on one end, but you've got rapid learning health systems on the other end where you're doing a lot of different analyses, constantly doing iterative looks at the data to try to learn as much as possible, as fast as possible. Trust me, we have so many things that we don't know about. We can't do everything with pragmatic randomized clinical trials. I think we have to get more comfortable at doing the other stuff that was mentioned previously to address the evidence gaps that we have.
Okay.
Well, I'll keep us in order then.
All right.
Thinking about opportunities, I think, I look back and I think 10 years ago, there was a perception that cost effectiveness research could be discriminatory, that it could be, and I think that when we shifted the mentality toward doing patient-centered outcomes research, right, one opportunity that we've, I think, achieved in the last 10 years is that, when you think about patient-centered outcomes research, we've gotten over that, that feeling that this kind of CER can be discriminatory and used and misused in a way that limits patients' treatment and access to personalized medicine. So I think with PCORI, the culture of research is changing. More researchers are valuing the patient engagement and the design of the research, which is something that frankly wasn't happening 10 plus years ago. And even I think PCORI, if they were here, would tell you that researchers took a little while to come around, right? I mean, at first it was, what do you mean I have to engage these patients? And how am I supposed to engage these patients? And God, it kind of is a pain to engage these patients, But once they actually did that and they got over that hurdle, they're learning that their research is that much better. And they're learning that, it's not as simple as drug A works better than drug B or treatment A works better than treatment B. There are nuances in terms of what the implications are for patients. And so I think, over the last 10 years, we've been able to overcome a lot of the ideas that I think were barriers to PCORI's initial authorization, but that now, I hope, in 2019, will make the discussion more informed and a little bit easier for us to have in terms of thinking about, okay, what are the next steps? The next step is, in terms of opportunities, is how do you now translate that information into tools that patients and providers can use to make good decisions? So it really, I think next we really need to be talking about shared decision making. And thankfully, PCORI's got a whole research agenda around shared decision making, which is great.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment, but go ahead.
Well, I would say ditto on the databases. I mean, clearly that's the hope of the future, to get the most information that we can. I would caution that the methodology has not been worked out completely yet, and that we're going to have a lot of people looking at these databases without the research skills that are necessary to really evaluate them. And that leads to the danger of coming to inappropriate conclusions. So I think we have to be very careful as we get into this, that it's done very rigorously. And I think for the most part it will be. I think the second thing is, how do we get the word out? How do we implement, translate the research? And there are a lot of techniques. There's a whole field called implementation science. But I think certainly for me, a significant proportion, more than has been spent so far in comparative effectiveness in the future, needs to be spent on how you disseminate this information and how you make it available, and what is reasonable utilization given the individualization issues and that sort of thing. The other thing I think that is important, it's not only patients that we should get into planning this research, it's non-researcher clinicians and even administrators, I say even, sorry, but a certain amount of this is administrative research, is research on health systems. And we instituted something, while I was at the VA, I instituted what was called the Create and Coin program, and VA loves acronyms. I don't remember what the acronyms mean, but what it was that for systems research, health administrators had to be involved, both clinician and non-clinician administrators, in planning the research, so that if the results turned out the way you thought they might, it would be used, it would be utilized. Because much of health services research and much of comparative effectiveness research is never used. And I think it's important that we get those inputs as well as the patient input in initially.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to go to a very central question in a moment, but I do want to tell you one more quick historical point, because I see Lisa Simpson is in the room. She asked a question before. She used to be at ARC, and in the 1990s, there was a big controversy over whether high-dose chemotherapy with autologous bone marrow transplant was effective. And my institute wanted to do a systematic review of these. So all we had to do was find the studies. The only problem we had, and this was technology that was spreading rapidly, was there were none. There were no controlled trials, not even randomized, but no controlled trials. So we had to use a methodology, and that's come up before. You have to use important methodologies. And what we discovered in the course of this was that more people, that thousands of people were dying from the treatment, not from breast cancer, because of the rigor of the procedure. And we thought, won't the world want to know that? And the answer was, no, they didn't. Because if you look at the alignment in the healthcare system, nobody had an interest except patients. And that was my discussion with Lisa, who helped us form a patient reference guide that said what we found and developed questions and potential discussion points so that patients could discuss with their physicians whether they wanted to go through that rigorous therapy, what their chances were. And I think we should think about that. It's not a bad model, and it's about lives. The other part of this story, and this is the segue into this part of the conversation, is about what's taking place now in comparative effectiveness research, because it's not just a government program, although there is this interaction. So here's my embedded question, okay? Do you see value-based payment creating new avenues for CER? For example, as providers take on more risk. So things like ACOs, for example. And I'd like your thinking on that.
So the construct that I put forward is the hope, and I think it's a very reasonable one, is that large organizations that establish sort of organized delivery systems will inform the treatments and the protocols and the process by which they deliver care consistent with the information that comes from comparative effectiveness research. Now that, back to the sort of common sense comment, that's just good medicine. That's how it should work. The real question is going to be whether those systems, when they are responsible for both the clinical outcomes and the financial outcomes, will utilize the work of comparative effectiveness research to inform the financial yield on those protocols for delivering care. And if they do, in essence, it's been a bit of an end run around the protections promulgated in the PCORI legislation. That said, I sleep very well at night trusting that large, respected healthcare systems, physicians who spend years of their lives in training, are trying to deliver the best care to every patient at every particular turn. But it does certainly change the dynamic.
Okay. So Newell, would you like to comment on that? Because I do have another thing I would like you to perhaps work in, which is your view of pharmaceuticals and the FDA process.
Just a very quick comment on this. And I don't know if everyone's familiar with Patrick Conway's continuum of alternative payment models, but it starts with sort of fee-for-service on one end and goes through sort of bilateral risk agreements all the way to capitated payments. And I think as providers go through this process, it's going to change their mindset and their receptivity to comparative effectiveness research. So I think historically, for the exact same reasons that you mentioned in your example before, if you're getting paid for something and you get a comparative effectiveness result saying that that may not be the right thing to do, then you have a little bit of misaligned incentives. But now with the new system, if you're being held accountable for outcomes, then you have, I think providers will have new receptivity to comparative effectiveness research.
Well, thank you. That's very articulate. I'll tell you what, we'll continue on this theme, then I'm going to come back to you on the FDA theme.
Okay.
Okay?
So, and I think that's a great point. I just was appointed to be on the guiding committee for this Healthcare Payment Learning Action Network, which is a contracted entity with CMS, CMMI. And you know, the interesting thing about that effort, you know, I've watched it over the last year. I'm on the Consumer Patient Affinity Group, and the original APM framework white paper that they put out called Cost Effectiveness, a Pillar of Patient-Centeredness, which we took issue with. And it's taken us a year to get that out of the framework, and it's out now. But I think that touches on a core issue of this value discussion, right? And it gets to the cost per quality discussion, which, you know, it's hard to make quality adjusted life years interesting. But we do have to be thinking about in the value discussion, are we treating an individual person or are we treating a population? And I think this is the thing that we're all struggling with, right? I mean, and this is the thing that this guiding committee, as being on this guiding committee, right, the Healthcare Payment Learning Action Network is struggling with this. Are we trying to drive payment models that drive standardized decisions that use ICER-style, you know, cost per quality reports to determine what they will and will not cover? Or are we going down this alternative path of really looking at individualized healthcare decisions that drive better adherence, less hospitalization, right? So they save money, but they save money in a different way. You know, so I think that CER and the style that we would support, you know, the more patient-centered version of it, can drive that healthcare system that is ultimately cost-effective. But we do have to be thinking about it in this broader context of where are we taking this healthcare system in terms of value? Is it value to the patient or is it value to the payer? And this is something I think we're going to continue to struggle with.
Well, that's what makes these more integrated systems more interesting, because you have, you know, realigned incentives. But Joe, go ahead.
Well, it's hard when you're the last person to come up with something new, but I'll pick up on the word population because that's what I was going to discuss. I think that's very important. I do think that these new payment models will have physicians thinking more about populations than about individual patients. Not that they won't think of individual patients, but it'll move them in that direction. And I think we have to look at both, as you said, the good side and the bad side, and that individualized decisions may not be considered as appropriate in that context. So, and in that sense, I think it will help the translation of comparative effectiveness research, which is designed for populations. And so I think that's what may happen. And I agree with you. We have to guard against that, because we have to be very careful about that, which is why I think it's so important that comparative effectiveness research has to take on individualization as it progresses, or else we're going to be having these just population decisions, which, you know, if you look at clinical guidelines, what % of patients do they apply to? It's quite variable. Some people say 80%, some people say 60%, some people say less than half. So I would agree very strongly that that's an important consideration as we move along.
Okay. I want to switch one of the topics, even though we have very little time, but I think it's very important, because you quoted Scott Gottlieb earlier and his opposition to comparative effectiveness research. However, a month ago, he did some very interesting testimony, and he said the use of generics and the FDA's decision about what is a generic equivalent is comparative effectiveness research. Can you tell us about that? Where do you think the FDA stands?
Your question is about generics? Or?
No, no, that's an example.
Okay, all right.
My question is, what is the role of the FDA in comparative effectiveness research?
Yeah.
What is the changing role as we look to the future?
So I'm not sure I can fully address that question, Jeff, but there was a paper not too long ago by Rob Califf and Rachel Sherman and others on their views of real-world evidence. I think the FDA is sort of moving in a direction of being more accepting of real-world evidence. But currently, for all of these kinds of studies, they don't make it into our label. And that has really important implications because if the data don't make it into the label, then we can't talk about it. And if we can't talk about it, then the people that have control of the budgets and the pharmaceutical companies aren't going to be interested in investing in studies that we can't talk about. So I think there are some regulatory issues that need to be addressed in terms of maybe figuring out how to get this kind of information into a label with the appropriate disclaimers so that we can then talk about it. And then I think you'll see much more private industry investment in this area. We are, by the way, currently at Boehringer Ingelheim doing a pragmatic randomized clinical trial at Anthem. But they're really relatively rare in the pharmaceutical industry.
Okay, that opens up another topic. Now, in the interests of being audience-centric, that's a little like patient-centric. Our time says that it's time for you to ask your questions. So I'd like to invite you to do that. And please wait till you get the mic.
Spencer Hodak with the Men's Health Network. Thank you so much, all of you, for your time. It's been wonderful. With the repeal or the reapproval of CER coming up in 2019, how can we make sure CER stays broad enough to cover smaller populations or smaller research focus areas in medicine?
Okay, would someone like to take that?
Well, there are techniques now to look at smaller populations within the larger study. Again, one has to be very precise about them. The classic way has been subgroup analysis, which has been very highly criticized, but I think if it's done properly, if it's done with a priori planning before the study is done and with the proper statistics, that's one way. Other smaller populations, comparing the results to databases of the particular populations that were studied and the outcomes in them. For example, if in low-risk patients, if the outcomes are very good anyway and not much different than what you get with whatever the intervention is, that's a group you might not want to use that intervention. And then there are ways of looking at site differences, which I think are also very important because not every site has the same resources, not every site has the same culture. So those are the kinds of smaller populations that we do have the techniques to look at. And I would hope that in the future, the people who are funding this kind of research really look at that.
Okay. Other questions from the audience?
Florence Fee, Executive Director of No Health Without Mental Health. We are a patient advocacy organization focused on integrating effective evidence-based mental health services into the primary care setting. We are experiencing a PCORI CER project as I speak. We are on the Consumer Advisory Board, along with NAMI and DBSA, Depression Bipolar Support, of a PCORI project called SPIRIT, the study to promote rural integrated telepsychiatry. Okay. This is touching on some of the themes, especially Senator Conrad's comments. This is an urgent patient need to integrate effective mental health services that will reach our veterans in rural, remote locations. So I just wanted to make two comments. First of all, to support Sarah's comments on the importance of having the patients, the consumers, also the family and advocacy organizations involved in CER. It's been our project started in 2015 and will run to 2020, so it's in process, but it's a fascinating experience. Mm-hmm. Our principal investigator is continually appreciative and at the inputs that the patients are, consumer advisory. So it is very important. However, I'd like to raise the point, we really have to fight to stay in the game. Okay. Because I think there's a lot of pressure on PIs to focus on other than the Consumer Advisory Board. And they have, time pressure and so forth. The second issue I'd like to raise and solicit comments is in the area of behavioral integration to primary care, we only have one evidence-based model, the collaborative care model, and it's extremely onerous for practices to implement. So we need more models of care. So the whole dissemination, implementation, it's a huge issue going forward. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay, would someone like to respond?
If I could open up a little bit on both of those points. One, I believe ARC has done some excellent work in promoting different practical models for integrating behavioral health into primary care. Not that there isn't lots of opportunity to do better, and I certainly agree with the questioner regarding the need for better attention to behavioral health services. However, an inherent challenge in evaluating such models is the nuanced differences in the delivery of behavioral health care. So at one extreme is a head-to-head drug or device trial where you're comparing two very specific interventions in a controlled environment. Behavioral health, fortunately or unfortunately, doesn't have that same kind of precision in its delivery. And I think that's handicapped behavioral health in getting attention and funding for that much needed work. I'm hopeful that experts in the field will come up with ways to get around that, more structured approaches that will allow for comparative effectiveness in behavioral health, because that is an absolute need for our country.
And I'll make 2 points. I mean, on your first point about patient engagement in the research projects, I mean, that is, I think, one of the highlights of PCORI is that they enforce the engagement between the researcher and the patient. And secondly, when you talk about creating new payment models, one thing that we've advocated very strongly for is to look at the model of patient engagement that you see now at PCORI, you see it more and more at FDA, and replicating that or at least using that as a model for CMMI and their alternative payment model development. That those alternative payment models really need to be co-created with the community of folks who are going to be in those models, right? And I think that, to date, there's been sort of this regulatory model of, throwing a proposed rule out there and then, getting comments, as opposed to sitting down earlier in the process and being more engaged about how you co-create those models with patients.
If I could just, it is possible to study these things. For example, we had a study of combined PTSD and smoking cessation clinics. Smoking is a big problem in PTSD. And it was a study that we had results that the model worked. I think there should be more studies like that.
Okay, well, we'll go on to other questions. One quick comment. When the IOM did the PCORI, their list of 100 topics they thought PCORI should undertake, they had it divided into 4 parts, quartiles, about what was important. So in the third of these quartiles was drug dependence, and that's a piece of the mental health issue. But you can see how in 2009, when that study was done and priority setting was done, it missed something that is a very critical issue and perhaps something that could be addressed through CER. So it's just a reinforcement of your mental health point.
Hi, Jeremy Loeffler with the Healthcare Service Corporation. We're a roll-up of 5 Blues. Touching on Sarah's point, we've touched on IPAB. We touched on earlier that comparative effectiveness shouldn't be cost effectiveness, and you've taken that word out. I'm just curious, though, we do have a reality of increasing healthcare costs and expenditures. The trustees said the trigger wasn't going to happen for IPAB, but we do have limited dollars. So my question is, what is the role of comparative effectiveness when the government needs to meet its fiscal responsibilities? I'm curious what the panel would say.
Okay, so panel, what do you say?
I mean, I would argue that the untested model is a truly patient-centered healthcare system. You know, the cost that you will contain with increased treatment adherence, less hospitalization, getting patients the right care at the right time. Let's test that model for cost effectiveness. You know, there's this idea that you can't have a cost-effective, patient-centered healthcare system, and I think that's wrong.
I'll add, if I could. I'm not sure I agree with that construct, but one place where maybe there could be general agreement is at the extremes. So if comparative effectiveness research shows that something doesn't work, and there's, you know, reasonable people can agree that it's established. You know, first, hopefully, the medical industrial complex won't continue to offer it, but who knows? But it sounds like I think it would be hard to argue that that particular service shouldn't be eligible for coverage. Now, it's complicated in the abstract. We can all agree it would be really messy in an individual case, but at least that's a start. At the extremes, I think there's opportunity for effective and responsible use of CER.
So just from an industry perspective, so I've had global positions in industry where we've had to make submissions, including cost effectiveness data, to health technology assessment agencies all over the world. And if you guys think England is the worst, let me take you to Germany. So there are worse health HTA agencies than NICE. But I think in the US, we've got a system that's got 30 or 40% waste in it. And we're doing a whole lot of things that we don't have any evidence on. So I think just in terms of priorities, there are other priorities in the US to address those issues that need to be done first.
I agree that good care is cost effective. I would agree with that. I think, though, that if you look at this, and since this is the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I think we saw in the first panel how conflicting ideas finally got together and synthesized something that I think was very good. I think that's the way these things should work. And on one hand, we've discussed this has been throughout probably every panel on this that's ever held, is the population side. On the other hand is the individual side. And somehow we have to make those meet for the benefit of both. And so I think that can happen, but I think it's important that all these interests be represented.
Well, thank you. Listen, this has been a very interesting panel, wide-ranging, and one thing you can be sure of, there are a lot of unsettled issues, and you can also be sure that the time has run out. So I'd like to thank you and to turn this back to Anand.
Jeff, thank you. Let me just offer a couple of just concluding remarks. First off, thank you to all of our speakers today for their very insightful, very informative remarks. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for just terrific questions as well. This is a conversation that won't end here today. However, I think it's, from BPC's perspective, one that we hope will have informed the discussion here in Washington, D.C. about the value of comparative effectiveness research and the important role both in the public sector as well as the private sector. So let's keep talking. We appreciate all the interest, and thanks for attending, and see you again soon. Thank you.